Lecture 36, Geoffrey Chaucer, The Canterbury Tales.
Welcome yet again, and a last time, to this series of lectures on Europe's literature in the Middle Ages. This time, our 12th lecture on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. We met Chaucer in some of his early work last time, so this time we can turn much more directly to his most famous work. The Canterbury Tales is an astonishing work in many ways. It's capable of provoking tears and guffaws. It's capable of provoking simple entertainment or of deep reflection. Like Boccaccio, Chaucer puts a collection of stories within a frame. And the frame is in some ways rather important to the stories, to those who tell the stories, and to how the stories are told. 29 pilgrims and a narrator, Chaucer himself, gather in Harry Bailey's Tabard Inn in Southwark in London before setting out for the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Now, a number of things potentially amusing about this. Southwark was sort of the red light district in London, and some of the characters on this pilgrimage, as we'll see in a moment, are rather improbable. But anyway, they set out on the journey to the shrine of Becket in Canterbury. Perfectly normal thing for 14th century people to be doing. So in other words, the frame is a very familiar one. Now Harry proposes that the pilgrims entertain themselves on the journey by telling tales. 2 on the way down, 2 on the way back. He gets them all to agree that they will chip in to buy dinner at the Tabard Inn. He's looking out for his own interest. They'll buy dinner at the Tabard Inn for the one who tells the best story. Well, right away we can see, just on technical grounds, we've got some rather interesting problems. We don't have 120 Canterbury Tales. We have 23. 2 of these are incomplete. So we've only got 21 completed Canterbury Tales. Chaucer assembled, and that's probably the right word, his Canterbury Tales between about 1387 and the time of his death in 1400. We'll never know what Chaucer wished the final look, the final shape of the Canterbury Tales to be, though it seems utterly clear that what we have is not what he would have wished to be the final version. First of all, for example, we don't have his autographed manuscript. There are 84 manuscripts that contain some portion of the tales. Of these, about 55 are reasonably complete. Now, the complete manuscripts present the tales in 10 blocks that are called fragments by scholars, by experts on Chaucer. It appears that Fragment 1, which contains the general prologue, the knights, the millers, the reeves, and the cook's tale, it appears that that was indeed intended by Chaucer to go first. It's then a matter of scholarly detective work exactly in which order to set the other 9 fragments. Now, the so-called Ellesmere manuscript, which is at the Huntington Library in Los Angeles, is generally taken as the base text, and there is a general consensus that its order of presenting the fragments is the order that ought to be followed. So in most of the standard editions of Chaucer that one might go to a bookstore and buy or go to a library and look at, what one finds is the arrangement of the Ellesmere manuscript. But it's just worth bearing in mind that we can't actually say with any confidence that we've got the tales arrayed as Chaucer would have arrayed them. Now, Chaucer worked on the tales for a long time, as I said a moment ago, and the surviving material shows considerable signs of his incomplete editing. Let me give just a few examples by way of illustrating the problem. The second nun is mentioned, but she's not described in the general prologue. She's given a tale to tell. The canon's yeoman is not mentioned in the general prologue, but he gets a tale. The shipman's tale was originally intended for the wife of Bath. The cook's and the squire's tales are the 2 that were never finished. The story of St. Cecilia was recycled. Chaucer had written this some 20 years earlier. He apparently thought it was a pretty good piece of work, by golly, and he shoved it into the Canterbury Tales, and he gave it to the second nun to tell. The Manciples and the physician's tales have no connection to their tellers. Now, it must be said there that critics make a little less of that, for some reasons we'll come to in a second. Critics make a little bit less of that today than they once did. But even if we don't want to dwell on the question of why the Manciple's tale, for example, doesn't seem to have anything to do with the Manciple, we might ask ourselves, what in the world is the monk doing on this pilgrimage? Monks are supposed to be in their monasteries. They're supposed to be cloistered. And why are the loathsome pardoner and Manciple going on pilgrimage at all? These are the most thoroughly amoral figures in the entire Canterbury Tales. They are not the kind of people who would have been on the road to Canterbury to seek remission for their sins. So there are puzzles like this that Chaucer simply doesn't resolve. Might he have done so? Well, all guesses are possible. For a long time, what is usually called the dramatic theory seemed to provide a kind of a unified explanation of the tales by using each tale to explain, in dramatic terms, the character of the tale's teller. Now, as you may know, Chaucer's general prologue sort of introduces us to the cast of characters, more or less fully, depending. Then each tale is told by one or another of the characters, of course, and the prologue to each tale more or less introduces us in a little bit greater detail to the teller of that particular tale. Then the teller of the tale tells a particular kind of story. So the dramatic theory sought to build and work out these connections between the prologue, the general prologue, the prologues to the tales, and the tales that are actually told. There are a lot of ways in which it's really difficult to force everything into that mold. And I think it's safe to say that today, most would argue that it's much better to see the tales as a series of artful literary experiments. It's Chaucer trying on a lot of different things for size. That, it seems to me, is more prudent than trying to look for a single overarching modern critical perspective that will stitch the tales together, or trying to find in the tales themselves a kind of an overarching perspective that would enable us to stitch them together, that enabled Chaucer to stitch them together. One might ask of Chaucer, as we asked of Boccaccio, was he actually in the end cellular? Was he better on the small scale? You see? Maybe he wasn't really so good at writing a great, big, comprehensive kind of book. No Dante was he, for instance, we might say. Now, for purposes of discussion, we can organize or categorize, if you like, the tales as romances, as comedies, some of which are fabliaux, what that is we'll come to in a second, pathetic stories, and then examples or fables. All right, let's begin then with the first of these, romances. 5 of the pilgrims tell romances. The knight, the squire, the wife of Bath, who tells the only Arthurian story in the bunch, the franklin, and the narrator. Come back to our narrator. That's Chaucer himself in a few minutes. The knight begins by retelling Boccaccio's Teseida. All right, this is the story of Theseus, who's come back from the wars. That's the main character. It's of course spelled and pronounced differently in all sorts of different languages. But Theseus has come back from the wars, and he's going to avenge the ladies whose husbands have been killed or unjustly mistreated. And then the story turns into the love story of Arcite and Palamon, who are wooing lovely Emily. All right, so the basic story was in place. It had been in place for a long time. It had been told in Chaucer's lifetime. It had been told by Boccaccio. Chaucer certainly knew Boccaccio's version, but he changes the story in a few ways, in some rather significant ways. For instance, he makes Arcite and Palamon much more explicitly the types of warrior and lover. Now, are we hearing there the kind of theme that Chaucer had worked out in Troilus and Cresside? Where on the one hand he situates Troilus between the great warrior Hector and the great lover Paris, and where even in Troilus himself, you see, we have the figure who is virtually debilitated by his love, his ennobling love perhaps, but his love for Cresside, and then the Troilus who can go out onto the field of battle and function there as a great warrior. So Chaucer here is tinkering a little bit with the conventions of the story and the conventions represented by the story. The tale also contains an extended reflection on fortune, destiny, and providence. Now, how many times have we in this course of lectures encountered authors who deal with the question of fortune? And of course, Chaucer himself, as we saw, had translated Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, one long section of which is a series of reflections on the Wheel of Fortune. Yes, that's older than Pat Sajak and Vanna White by a long shot. Well, Chaucer takes us through this set of reflections on destiny and fortune and providence, and finally reduces all to providence. Finally, all is in the hands of God. So courtly values are set off against philosophical values, but Chaucer really doesn't choose explicitly between them. In some ways, he leaves us to do that. There's interesting ways, too, in which this particular tale subtly encodes a defense of traditional social hierarchies. I want to take just a second to pursue this because it has sometimes been the case that critics will try to take Chaucer as a searing critic of the social injustice of his own time and as a staunch supporter of the middle class, or a person sympathetic to the lower classes, or a person who dislikes aristocracy, or a person who dislikes the mercantile values of the London in which he grew up, and so on. Forcing Chaucer into those kinds of modes, it seems to me, is much more reflective of the kinds of modes currently in vogue in various universities and university departments, and hasn't got much to do with Chaucer at all. But anyway, let's see what Chaucer does with the Knight's Tale. The knight is the highest class person in the entourage. He's not a member of the aristocracy. Two groups are absent. I mean, Chaucer in some ways has the whole world sort of on that pilgrimage, but two groups are absent: the high aristocracy and the peasantry. Neither of those groups is there. The plowman, you might say, what about the plowman? A plowman was a skilled worker, a very valuable person. Plowmen would go around and hire themselves out from place to place because they had high skills. But the knight is the person of highest social status among those on the pilgrimage. He speaks first. In the prologue to the very next tale, everyone comments ever so properly on what a wonderful and knightly tale the knight had just told. In other words, all of them are, as it were, upholding traditional hierarchy, and the knight tells a knightly tale. Do we have here, you see, Chaucer, in a kind of way that was at once subtle and blatant, like Boccaccio in the Decameron, mocking convention and traditional order and upholding tradition and conventional order simultaneously. Now the narrator, Chaucer himself, surely, tells us his tale of Sir Topaz. Now, this is actually quite amusing on several different fronts. Harry Bailey gets to sort of presumably pick, who's coming forward to tell a tale. So Harry calls forward sort of cuddly, chubby Chaucer. And he's going to tell a tale. Point of fact, the narrator tells two tales. He tells the tale of Topaz, then he tells the tale of Melibea. We don't have time here to talk about Melibea. We'll say a word or two about Topaz. Well, Chaucer apologizes profusely to the group because he says, well, I only know one story. Well, this is the guy who's telling us who was going to tell us 120 of them. He said, well, I only know one story. And then he says, and at that it's in rhyme. Well, he meant a kind of an old-fashioned kind of rhyme. So he's digging at certain contemporary writers. He then launches into a completely incoherent and pointless tale. I mean, Topaz, it's all very courtly and all very nice, and it's as if he hangs every courtly convention out there, utterly drained of all blood and life. The tale is so bad that Harry butts in and cuts him off. Now, here is Chaucer at his self-deprecating best. He's really poking fun at himself, and seemingly having quite a good time at it. But he's also displaying considerable cheek. He puts himself in the tale as the narrator, then he gives himself two stories to tell. Everybody's supposed to tell one. He gives himself two. And then, of course, he has this bit of mock theater with Harry Bailey. Now, again, is this an echo of that story from the Decameron where Boccaccio, you see, has this rather buffoonish character telling a bad story poorly, such that the woman who's riding along with him wants down, you see, that if you're going to tell a story, then, by golly, tell a good story and tell it well. Okay, but we may also ask, is Chaucer here making a point about chivalry with this ridiculous figure of Topaz? Is he mocking the ever-so-chivalric knight? Well, you know, that's a little hard to say. But in retrospect, what if we looked back to the Knight's Tale? Are Palamon and Arcite in some ways foolish because disempowered, weakened by love, they simply can't act? So there, you see, we could say he might be playing with the conventions of courtly love, chivalry in that sense, or playing with chivalry in the sense that we saw it in Roland, that we saw it in Cid, of guy stuff. Well, hard to say. The questions are unquestionably there. Chaucer told 6 comedic tales. Those of the miller, the reeve, the shipman, the merchant, the friar, and the summoner. These tales are set in the present. They're set in familiar surroundings. Their language typically is coarse. It can border on the obscene. If Petrarch set civic virtue off against the chivalric or courtly, then these tales may be said to set cleverness off against nobility. Now let's bear in mind, Chaucer translated the Romance of the Rose. It was the work that influenced him more than any other single work. And we have in Jean de Meun's section of the Romance of the Rose that wonderful problem of, midst all this nobility and midst all this moralizing, lover is encouraged to lie, cheat, and steal to get what he wants. The stories are carnivalesque and parodic. Let me just pause briefly and talk about those two words. The parodies here are not parodies of Chaucer's world, they're parodies of the other tales and the other characters in the tales. By carnivalesque, I mean this. Carnival, by long tradition and by anthropological definition, is a suspension of the ordinary rules of the game, where all is folly and foolishness, but one knows of a certainty that the ordinary rules of the game are going to be reinstated. It is as if there is a pause in time. Hence, Carnival is not to be taken explicitly or implicitly as criticism, as commentary on the world, people in the world, customs in the world, practices in the world, and so on. That's in a very real way how Chaucer's stories work. They are carnivalesque. We mustn't look at them, so it seems to me, as explicit criticisms of the world Chaucer lived in. He's just telling funny stories. But there may be just a little more to it than that. We'll see as we go along. 4, the miller, the reeve, the shipman, and the merchant are fabliaux. Now, fabliaux is a particular type of comedy. Typically, here's what it is. A bourgeois husband is duped into conniving at his wife's sexual liaison with another man. Almost without exception, that other man is younger, smarter, handsomer, and so on than the husband. All right, we've met tales like this in Boccaccio. These kinds of tales go back to 12th century French stories and so on. So again, Chaucer doesn't by any means invent the fabliaux. The Miller's Tale, which comes second. Knight's Tale is first in the Canterbury Tales. The Miller's Tale is second. Is one of Chaucer's finest, right from the point where the drunken miller butts in and demands to tell his tale. The knight has told his tale. Everybody, as I mentioned, is applauding and saying, oh, what a wonderful tale that was. And Harry's going to move on, and the miller butts in, I'm going to tell my story now. Well, he tells a story about John the carpenter, Alison, his wife, Nicholas, a student who lodges with them, and the parish priest, Absalom. Now, these are really, in lots of ways, quite engaging characters. For example, John the carpenter is a kind and good and decent man. He's a little slow. We do wonder how he comes to have this young and beautiful wife, but anyway, there we have it. Now, Nicholas, predictably, and Alison sort of begin to get eyes for each other. Now, it must be said that Alison at first protests and tries to be faithful to her husband. Nicholas is really quite persistent, and eventually she succumbs to Nicholas's enticements. Meanwhile, the parish priest Absalom is head over heels in love with Alison as well. So we have a kind of a very interesting and complicated love triangle. And at one point, finally, Nicholas, who is a student, persuades, of course, John the carpenter that because he's a great university scholar, he knows that there's going to be a terrible flood coming and they must all save themselves. So there's a rather small tub in the cottage in which John and Alison and Nicholas live, and John agrees to get in the tub. They hoist him up to the roof, telling him, of course, that Nicholas and Alison are also going to get into tubs to protect themselves from the tremendous flood waters. So while, of course, John is up by the roof, Nicholas and Alison are able to disport themselves. I mean, poor Absalom comes and he's singing songs outside the window and wants terribly much to enjoy Alison's favors, not realizing, of course, that Nicholas is in the house enjoying Alison's favors. And there are also one or two scenes in the story that are not for family newspapers or television. They're pretty amusing, but I'll just leave them out. What's interesting here is that we don't in the end come away liking or disliking anyone. We're not being taught a moral here. The characters are credible, we like them, they're funny. It's a bit like watching a sitcom. You know, when it's done, we've had a good laugh and we move on to the next thing. There's no preachy tone, really, in this story, and it's hard, finally, to see the story as explicitly or implicitly mocking, criticizing, commenting on much of anything, except in the mind of the Reeve, who comes next. Now, the Reeve's tale is a wonderful example of Chaucer at work. The Reeve had been a carpenter. He takes umbrage at the miller, the drunken miller, telling a story about a cuckolded carpenter. So he, the Reeve, tells a story, a disparaging story, about a venal, grotesque, even physically grotesque, and cuckolded miller. Now, almost as a manifestation of this ill faith, in other words, we're invited to think that the Reeve might have been going down the road thinking of any number of stories he might have told, and then the miller got going on this story, this terrible, offensive story about a carpenter, so the Reeve says, by gosh, I'm going to get that miller back, and he tells a story about a miller. Well, so we have a sense of ill faith. The Reeve's characters are actually uninteresting. This is the tale where you've got everybody in the house at night, hopping from bed to bed to bed to bed, contriving, of course, the student lodgers to get together with the daughter of the householder, the wife of the householder, and everybody is moving around from sort of bed to bed. The story seems contrived somehow. We don't actually know these characters very well, as we do in The Miller's Tale. We don't like them very much. We just don't sort of engage with them. So as I said, here what we have really is Chaucer very much more commenting on telling stories and commenting on the artistry of his Canterbury Tales as a single architectural whole. Let's turn to the pathetic tales, those of the man of law, the second nun, the clerk, the physician, the prioress, and the monk. These tales, we must emphasize, are characteristic of 14th, not of 21st century taste. The point of the tales, no two are really alike, is to evoke a strong emotional response, primarily sympathy. Characterizations are simple. Sometimes the people seem almost two-dimensional to us. The main characters are passive in the face of sheer evil and brutality. We immediately respond and say, act, do something, get yourself out of that trouble, pick yourself up, fight back. But that's not the way the tales were told. Here is where Chaucer tells, through this clerk, his young student at Oxford, the story of patient Griselda. Now, we met this tale in Boccaccio. Petrarch also told the tale. Griselda, of course, is the daughter of a shepherd, and the local castellan, whose name is Walter, has gone well on into life. He hasn't married. His key companions have been urging him to marry, so he goes out and he picks out Griselda, and he decides to test her. Is she going to be loyal? So he takes away her first child, allegedly to kill the child. He really sent the child away to York. A bit later, a few years later, he takes away her second child, again to kill it, sends it away to York. And a few years after that, dismisses her from court. Then he sends out word that he's to be married again, and he invites her to come back to sort of prepare the court and prepare everything for the new wife. Finally, having satisfied himself that patient Griselda has been just sort of flawless in her acceptance of all this appalling treatment, he reveals all to her. The beautiful young girl he's going to marry is not his intended bride at all. It's Griselda's daughter. Her son is still there at court. She's received back into court, and all seems to be well. The clerk clearly sympathizes with Griselda. So Chaucer doesn't accept Petrarch's way of telling this story. Petrarch turned Griselda into a kind of a martyr figure, into a kind of a model of Christian obedience. The clerk clearly sympathizes with Griselda. But there are hints that contemporaries would have read the story a little differently. Pride was the greatest of the sins. Humility was its remedy. The more humble you were, the less proud you were. God tests his people. The more faithful, the harder. Obedience and deference are prized in a hierarchical society. What is Chaucer's stand here? I think we can never know. But he invites us to think about Griselda. Those tales that can be called examples or fables, the friars, the pardoners, the nuns, priest, and the mancibles. These tales are not much to the taste of people now, for the fundamental reason that, as an example, as a fable, it is meant to articulate a universal truth valid for everybody all the time, everywhere. People today are much more skeptical about the idea that there is universal truth, that there are things that are always valid for everyone, everywhere. Here we have, for example, the nun's priest tale, with the famous and gabby rooster Chanticleer. This is the only beast tale that Chaucer included in the Canterbury Tales. Here, of course, is the story of the rooster who is captured by the fox, and then the rooster has to manage to persuade the fox, to trick the fox into talking. When the fox talks, he opens his jaw, and the rooster gets away. Eventually, the tale actually goes all the way back to Aesop. So it's an old kind of tale. The pardoner's tale is finally a tale of blasphemy. The pardoner is this wretched character who gives people pardon from the church, who gives them pardon from the temporal punishment for their sins, pardon from time spent in purgatory. He is utterly cynical. This is a really disgusting guy. Well, what are we to make of it? It's much easier, I think, in the end, to catalog the kinds of questions that Chaucer forces us to answer than to provide convincing answers. Is Griselda, for example, the opposite of the wife of Bath? The wife of Bath, the assertive, vigorous woman who defends women, who defends women's rights, who laments the treatment of women in her time, is Griselda, in a sense, the opposite of that? And then, which of the two are we supposed to like, admire, emulate? Are women idealized in a misogynistic way or in an ironic way? What do we make of the prioress? What do we make of elegant Lady Eglantine? Is she more the lady or more the prioress? Is she a religious figure or a secular figure? Does Chaucer believe, with the wife of Bath, that nobility is not a matter of birth? Or is he upholding the traditional notion of aristocracy? He's been patronized by the aristocrats for a long time. What do we make of the narrator? Here we have something that is very reminiscent of Dante. For we have, remember, Dante poet and Dante protagonist? Here again we have Chaucer poet and Chaucer protagonist. Has he veiled himself? Has he veiled his narrative? Has he veiled his story? Is he commenting on someone, commenting on all these tale tellers, commenting on all the things they comment on in their tales? Where does it stop? What are we supposed to think? When can we, in a sense, make this thing stop and gain some sense of stability in trying to understand it? The general prologue begins with a springtime topos, full of piercings in the presence of a flower. The sexual innuendo is clear. Now, is this a comment on the courtliness, you see, of starting a story in the spring. Do you remember The Romance of the Rose? Began in May with a young man at the right age for love and the right time for love. So from the very first lines of the general prologue, must we approach the Canterbury Tales wink, wink, wink as a series of tricks that Chaucer has played on us, but that he delights in our uncovering and discovering. Well, in a way, it doesn't really matter what I think or what anyone else does. Chaucer will unquestionably go on delighting and puzzling us as long as English literature is read.